Hello and welcome to this next episode in the BSO's Meet the Music series, when I'll be taking a deep dive into the Violin Concerto by the Austrian composer Alban Berg. Without hesitation, I deem it one of the very greatest concertos for the instrument of the last century. As Berg's name is perhaps unfamiliar to some of you, I thought I'd start with a potted history of his life and career. Born in 1886 in Vienna, Berg's musical education as a child was negligible. When he was 18, by pure chance, he saw a newspaper advertisement placed by the composer Johann Schoenberg seeking pupils. Their subsequent meeting was arguably the most important single event in Berg's life. Schoenberg, his senior by 12 years, becoming not just his teacher, but also his mentor and father figure as well. Consequently, determined to earn his living through music, Berg gave up his post in the Austrian civil service and hence became a leading figure in the Viennese musical avant-garde in the early decades of the 20th century. At coffeehouse gatherings, together with Schoenberg and Berg's fellow pupil Anton Webern, he joined the circle of succession artists, painters like Gustav Klimt and Oskar Kokoschka, writers and playwrights, Peter Altenberg and Franz Wedekind, and above all, the towering figure of Gustav Mahler. Berg's early works include a piano sonata and string quartet. Then, in 1913, two of his settings of 5 poems by Altenberg caused a riot at their premiere. Between 1913 and 14, he composed his 3 pieces for orchestra under the spell that Mahler's Ninth Symphony had made on him. Also in 1913, he saw the Viennese premiere of Georg Büchner's play Wozzeck, which by 1920 he turned into an opera, drawing into it his own experiences during military service in World War I. Despite a predictable furore at its premiere in 1926, the opera was rapidly hailed as a masterpiece. In the decade that followed, Berg's output included the lyric suite and the chamber concerto. He interrupted work on his second opera, Lulu, to write the Violin Concerto, but died in 1936 of septicemia before finishing the third act. Due to Berg's widow suppressing attempts to complete it, the full opera didn't receive its first performance until 1979. Berg followed Schoenberg's path into music that was atonal, so without the structure of key centers, then his teacher's dodecaphonic or 12-note method of composition. However, he used it in a thoroughly individual manner which frequently utilized tonality. Nearly 90 years since his death, Berg remains the most accessible to audiences of the composers of the so-called Second Viennese school and is recognized among the greatest masters of 20th century composition. Before I start diving into this fascinating work, I must acknowledge 3 musicologists in particular whose writing and insight in the concerto has helped me with the preparation of this talk: Michael Steinberg, Moscow Kana, and Douglas Jarman. The concerto was commissioned by the Russian-born American violinist Louis Krasner, and initially the composer prevaricated about accepting the commission since he wanted to complete Lulu first. However, he was strapped for money and accepted, but was slow to start composing while he pondered its form. It was to take a tragic event to galvanize him: the death on the 22nd of April 1935 of Manon Gropius, the 18-year-old daughter of Alma Mahler and her second husband, the architect Walter Gropius. Manon, by all accounts, was intelligent, beautiful, gentle, and was studying to be an actress. She was struck down with polio in 1934, with paralysis and death following. Berg was fond of Manon and deeply attached to Anna as the widow of the composer he revered. Now he wanted to compose a requiem for her, and did so through his concerto for Krasner. To understand the work, we need to dive into aspects of Berg's personality, and, as Michael Steinberg has succinctly put it, below the surface of Berg's outward life churned a turbulence, political, financial, and amorous. He was deeply depressed about the Nazi regime in Germany, and similarly the lurch to the right in Austrian politics. He was hurt and worried by the accusations that as a follower of the radical Schoenberg, he was un-Austrian, not bodenstandig, which translated means not truly affiliated with his native soil and its people. In Germany, his works were attacked as degenerate and an example of cultural Bolshevism, which led to Wozzeck being banned. Consequently, his income from royalties diminished, which led to a worrying financial situation. His emotional life was in a constant state of turmoil, for although both he and his wife Helene, whom he married in 1911, kept up the appearances of a perfect marriage, this was far from the truth, and Berg had various affairs which all ended badly. Then, in 1925, he started a relationship with Hannah Fuchs-Robertin, the wife of a Prague paper manufacturer and the sister of the novelist Franz Werfel, who was Alma Mahler's lover and eventually her third and last husband. The primary work of Berg, inspired by Hannah, was the Lyric Suite of 1926, and he had given her a copy of the score in which he detailed the clues for her to decode what was in effect his declaration of love for her. There's no evidence to suggest that either thought of ending their marriages. Hannah would have lost her children, and Berg knew that Helene understood him and all his quirks, and that he depended on her in many ways. In fact, it seems that both Helene and Hannah's husband knew about the relationship, and to add a curious twist, Hannah's daughter maintained that it was never consummated. And a further vital element in the background to the work was Berg's superstitious obsession with numbers. He was deeply influenced by the theories of the German otolaryngologist Wilhelm Fliess, whose contention was that the whole of life, human beings, animals and plants, was governed by two constants, the number 28 associated with females, and for males it was the number 23. These numbers have considerable bearing in the compositional process of the concerto. The metronome marks and structural divisions of Part 1 are all linked to the female 28 and its multiples, whilst in Part 2 it's the male 23 and its multiples. Hence Part 1 opens with a metronome mark of 56, so 2 times 28. And in Part 2 it's 69, so 23 times 3. In addition, for reasons that are still yet unknown, Berg and Hannah had decided between them that 10 was her special number, so that has a role to play too, as do both his and her initials. B in German music notation equates to B flat in English, and H in German is RB natural. Their musical initials therefore read AB flat for Berg and BF for Hannah, and these appear, again quoting Steinberg, individually, side by side, embraced and intertwined. Generally, Berg composed slowly. However, with the violin concerto, he worked at fever pitch. Indeed, Krasner recalled that Helene Berg told him that her husband refused to stop for food or sleep, but drove his hand relentlessly. She would plead with him to rest, but he simply replied, "I must continue. I cannot stop. I do not have time." It was almost as if he was writing his own requiem as much as Manon's. In June 1935, Krasner stayed with the Bergs at their country house on the Wörthersee, where the composer liked to point out that it was just across the lake from Purtzach, where Brahms had composed his violin concerto. He asked Krasner to improvise constantly, so that he could get the measure of his characteristic skills and technique. In the meanwhile, Berg and Helene would go about their everyday business. Every so often, Krasner started playing real works, whereupon Berg would call from wherever he was in the house, "No, please, no concertos, just play." On the 16th of July, Berg wrote to Krasner that the day before he'd finished what he called our concerto, apart from scoring it. "I am perhaps even more astonished than you. I was, to be sure, industrious as never before in my life. I must add that the work gave me more and more joy. I hope, no, I believe confidently that I have succeeded." The following month, on the 11th of August, he finished the orchestration. Then a few days later, he was stung by a wasp. Over the following weeks, carbuncles and boils developed, and then an abscess on his back, which, according to one source and a reliable one, Helene Berg lanced it with a pair of scissors. Finally, septicemia set in, and on the 23rd of December, note the number, having been hospitalized for a week, Berg told his wife that that day would be critical for him. Helene lied to him by surreptitiously moving the clocks forward, but by now he was dying. He survived just 1 hour and a quarter into the 24th. Hence, he never heard a note of the concerto. Its first performance took place in Barcelona at the International Society for Contemporary Music in April 1936 with Krasner and the Paukerhaus Orchestra conducted by Hermann Scherchen. In the audience was the 23-year-old Benjamin Britten. The work made a huge impression on him. The concerto is scored for standard 20th century orchestral forces. 2 flutes, then triple winds, with an additional clarinet doubling alto saxophone. In the brass there are 2 rather than the usual 3 trombones, then percussion, strings and harp. Harmonically, Berg follows the system Schoenberg created in the early 1920s, which I mentioned earlier, and became known as serial music. He created it to replace the tonal system of roughly the previous 2 centuries, which by the opening decades of the 20th had, believe Schoenberg, exhausted its possibilities, and a new melodic and harmonic modus operandi was needed for composing. Schoenberg's basis for a work is a row of 12 notes in a fixed order, which can be used in the creation of harmony or melody. The row can also be played inverted, or in retrograde introversion. As we will discover, though, Berg was so clever in the creation of his row for the concerto that the sequence also has tonal implications. Overall, the concerto has an arch shape and is cast in 2 parts, each comprising 2 movements which are played without a break, and the end of each movement is closely linked with the beginning of the one that follows. The movements of part 1 are andante and allegretto, and combined they last for about 12 minutes, while part 2, it's allegro and adagio, and they're about 70 minutes in duration. The concerto begins quietly with an introduction, featuring harp, clarinets, and the solo violin, which plays the 4 open strings of the instrument, G, D, A, E. It's exactly 10 bars long, the number, as previously discussed, which Berg associated with Hannah. After the cadence has just been reached, an accompanying figure is established and the first movement properly begins and follows an ABA form. At the soloist's next entry, the complete 12-note row is revealed. And let's now examine how consciously Berg constructed his tone row so that it has resonances with tonality. The first 3 notes, G, B flat, D, make up a G minor arpeggio. Starting on the D and with the next 2 notes, F sharp and A, there's a D major triad. ACE is an A minor triad, and starting on E, an E major triad is made, E, G sharp and B. The final 4 to make up the 12 notes are B natural, C sharp, E flat and F. More about them later. Let's hear the row now. Moscow Kana suggests that the unveiling of the row and the music that follows seemed to evoke Manon's tenderness and loveliness. After it, a short bridge section follows in the same tempo. With a change of tempo to un poco grazioso, the middle B section of the movement begins. Kahner surmises that here Berg portrays Manon's charm and grace, but he pertinently comments as if seen through a veil. With the next bridge section, which is marked molto più tranquillo, the music starts to retrace its steps back to the A section and the introduction. Berg shortens both the A section and the introduction as they return, as well as altering the scoring. Here's the start of the A section's recall with flutes, clarinet and harp to the fore. We're back finally to the introduction and a transition to the second movement. Kahner feels that the Allegretto's second movement of Part 1 paints a portrait of the young girl's youthful joie de vivre and vivacity. Like the Andante first movement, it's cast in ternary form as a scherzo and two trios, with the former itself tripartite. It's music in the Austrian pastoral tradition, with the soloist asked to play scherzando, wienerisch and rustico, during which Steinberg hears the hiccup of a yodel. And here's the start of the first trio, which is marked subito un poco energico, and, Kahner suggests, creates in its upward and downward leaps and the solo violin's triple stops a mood of unrestrained high spirits. A climax is reached when the brass hammer out a waltz rhythm. Trio 2, Meno Mosso, is played by the orchestra alone. By contrast, it's slower and lyrical, created from a gently rocking theme. Trio 1 now returns in a shortened guise and with the marking poco energico. The scherzo music returns, led by the clarinets. During the third manifestation of the scherzo, Berg quotes a folk song from the Carinthian area of Austria, which has a rather ribald text involving a young man and woman, the latter called Mitzi. Berg instructs that it's to be played unmerklich, hence introduced imperceptibly as it's passed between horn, solo violin and two trumpets. As uncovered by the Berg expert Douglas Jarman, it's yet another hidden allusion to Berg's personal life, being a reference to his teenage sweetheart, Mitzi Schul, the Berg's family maid with whom he fathered a daughter named Albertine. Jarman notes that Berg probably enjoyed the play on words implied by the similarity between the songs Mitzi and Manon's pet name Mutzi. In the score, Berg gives it a tempo indication, comma una pastorale. Part 1 ends with a coda, quasi stretta, which means faster and faster, largely based on the waltz rhythms of the first trio, with the solo violin playing the 12-note row in a series of arpeggios. Although the movement ends in the key of G minor, because of the triad created from the first three notes of the row, G, B flat and D, the addition of the fourth note in the series, F sharp, creates a dissonant frisson. The third movement, Allegro, opens part 2 violently, with a level of distance not encountered so far in the work, a spread chord comprising the other 8 notes of the 12-note row. Steinberg calls it a vision of catastrophe. Kahner describes it as entering the sphere of suffering, torment, agony, and final death. Once more, the movement structure is ternary. After this agonizing explosion of emotion, the solo violin launches into a fiery cadenza, whose first gesture is a variant of the open strings arpeggio that began the work. ominous, jagged dotted rhythm is heard in the horns at bar 23, that number again. In Berg's operas, similar rhythms are associated with fear and anxiety. The next excerpt starts just before the rhythm is heard. Listen for the soloist's scale hurtling downwards, at the end of which the rhythm starts. At the beginning of section B, Berg starts revealing the opening of a Bach chorale. However, it's sort of under wraps since we hear it in its retrograde version. A little later on, there's a passage clearly derived from the initial revelation of the tone row. The B section culminates in a slower cadenza with more fireworks from the soloist, including ferocious triple stopping. There's a brief linking passage to the A2 section, with the soloist playing the open strings again as at the start of part 1 and the clarinet softly following. With the beginning of the A2 section, the orchestra re-enters with the same dissonant chord but open part 2. The music now pushes forward towards an immense climax on a 9-note chord hammered out to the ominous rhythm. Steinberg describes it as music of snarling brass, and Berg labelled it Höhepunkt in capital letters to indicate it's the climactic moment of the movement. Berg had wanted a Bach chorale to conclude his requiem, but was having no luck in finding one suitable. Consequently, he was well into the composition before a colleague sent him Bach's setting of Es ist genug, it is enough, from Cantata number 60, O Ewig du Donnerwort, O Eternity, thou word of thunder, the chorale melody by the 17th century church musician Johann Strauss. Translated, the words of the chorale are, It is enough. Lord, if it please you, unyoke me now. My Jesus comes. Now good night, O world, I travel to my heavenly home, I travel surely and in peace. My great distress remains below. It is enough, it is enough. It was so apt, Berg could hardly believe his good fortune. Not only was the text appropriate in the context of Manon's tragedy, but the chorale melody's first 4 notes were the same as the final 4 of his 12-note row. Moreover, harmonically, it was one of Bach's most adventurous and chromatic chorales, which fitted hand in glove with Berg's own compositional voice. Here's how it's first heard in its true guise, as the music subsides and softens from that anguished climax. Berg's and Bach's harmonizations alternate and subtly intersect. Berg presents each line in his own setting, the melody played by the violin. With Bach's version played by a quartet of clarinets, the effect is like the organ of a village church. Berg's presence remains, though, through pianissimo comments in the strings. He marks the successive phrases of the chorale tune deciso, doloroso, dolce, risoluto, then from the final phrase, molto espressivo e amoroso, which at first seems a little odd in this context, but which is made clear when Berg and Hanna's musical signatures follow no less than 10 times. Here's Bach's harmonization of the first phrase of the chorale. Two variations follow the statement of the chorale. The first begins with the melody in muted cellos and harp. It's marked misterioso. The solo violin, similarly muted, joins them. A single violin from the orchestra adds its voice, then another, then more and more, until Berg asks that the soloist audibly and visibly assumes leadership of the violins and violas. Krasner said that Berg viewed this as the real cadenza of the concerto, and that he thought of this passage as one in which you seem to perceive the solo through an ever stronger magnifying glass until one violin, grown to overwhelming dimensions, entirely fills the hall. The second variation leads to the Höhepunkt of the Adagio. As soloist, violins and violas soar upwards to the emotional climax of the movement and indeed the whole concerto. Then the process is reversed, as gradually the orchestral strings drop away until only the soloist is left. Steinberg notes the wonderful calm descending upon the music, as the Corinthian folk song returns, wie aus der Ferne, as if from a distance, kind of suggesting that its effect is heightened by its wraith-like scoring. In the coda, Berg shortens the chorale melody, which in Steinberg's memorable words is garlanded with a filigree of solo strings. We'll start a couple of bars before the coda, as the soloist high in the instrument's register has two falling, sorrowful sighs, against the tenor trombone playing the opening notes of the chorale, which are repeated by flutes and saxophone. The last music we hear of this profoundly moving work is a barely recognizable recollection of the concerto's opening. Thinking of Manon's fate, words from the chorale linger, my great distress remains below. Her earthly trials are over, the music telling us that indeed it is enough, it is enough.